Sony has been making the news waves right now with talking about the future of their studios. And like Microsoft, they had hinted that they are interested in acquiring certain studios to add to their catalog of massive talent. Now, Microsoft has been doing that for quite some time now. They've added multiple studios to their games division and hopes to compete with Sony. But there has also been another news story that came out just yesterday talking about Sony in talks to possibly a bid to acquire Remedy Entertainment, which is another studio that they could potentially bring into their catapult. So since this news story has been going around, I decided to make my own top 5 list of the best studios that Sony should be interested in acquiring to add to their studio catalog. Each are different, each add their own finesse to every aspect of why you should bring them in, but I broke this down. Obviously, I take bias aside and I really break it down to these certain categories. What kind of games have they made in regards to like what specific games have they made? What quality are their franchises that they own, their properties? What types of games do they make? What genres do they make that make them so good at what they do? And then finally, what's the X factor? What's the extra little thing that they can bring in that no other studio can do for on whatever they own on their property end, or what that studio can bring to the table that will up the ante and up the talent that Sony Studios, first-party studios, will have. And it's breaking it all down from my top 5 list. So we're going right into it, which I hope to hear your top 5 list down below in the comments, which is number 5, MVHR, Studio MVHR, which you might know them from making Cuphead. Now, Cuphead is their first and only game that they've made, and it's a really good game, both reviewed well and also sold really well. And now that the game is they have just the first game under their belt, they don't have like multiple franchises to rely upon. But I think if Sony can get them to be their first party studio, I think they can make Cuphead the next Sony's next Mario franchise. I think it's got the appeal, the attention. I think they can bring it to the table where it's appeal to all people, kids, adults, everything. I mean, that thing is just it's got so much flavor. It's like Disney. It's like old school Disney. People will eat this franchise up. And I think you could expand it to multiple areas in regards to this. I think they could expand Cuphead to make multiple different kinds of games, so they could make it a full side-scrolling adventure game. I think they could transfer it like Mario with a 3D platformer. I think they could do that with Cuphead, which leaves the franchise with endless options of what you can do with the Cuphead franchise. Now, obviously, with being from an indie developer to being a first-party studio for Sony, they're going to have tons of resources, financial resources, contacts to talk to different developers within the Sony community that could really edge up their game even more. They could even make new franchises. I bet these people have interesting minds of what they could create next if they had unlimited access and resources that they did not get when they were when they were an indie developer studio. Now, Cuphead, what does really well, what does the studio do really well? They are good at the side-scrolling boss battling platform, which, they do it really, really well. The game is really good, and I think it's unique also that it kind of creates its own niche with the boss battling side platformer, and I think they've proven that that's kind of its own thing and makes it quite unique compared to just the standard platformer, which I think they could still do a standard platformer with Cuphead. And now the final thing, the X factor. And, I think, and I talked about it just slightly earlier, as I think this studio really has not been able to live up to its true potential. Obviously, it's had one game under its belt, so it's really, really fresh and really, really new. But I think with larger resources and a vast network of people to connect to, I think they can either make something really, really special that is quite unique from everything else. Honestly, they could make Cuphead and then also work on an entirely new franchise, a project they've always dreamed of working on, that if they had the unlimited resources, they can make it. And if someone made something quite unique like Cuphead, I think they have more ideas under their sleeve that I think really could boost up Sony in another way that they've never seen before. Now, that is my number 5. Now to number 4. Remedy Entertainment. Yes, the news story where they said they were considering buying Remedy, I think it is a smart play, and here is why. There are a lot of games that they have in their library that they've done. They've done the first 2 Max Paynes, which have reviewed and gotten quite an appeal in regards to Max Payne. Also, they've done Alan Wake, which also they have talked about that they have received the rights back because of the time that they had signed with Microsoft. They now own the rights to Alan Wake, which means if they go with Sony, Alan Wake could be a franchise for them. They also made Quantum Break, and they also are making Control currently. That will be out later this year. Now, some of the franchises that they do have, they have great franchises, and they have either gotten good scores or they've gotten great scores in reviews. And they all have sold well, and they stand out. They're very unique. They're very different. Each franchise has some kind of spin on it that's different than any other franchise out there, which I think is the great appeal that Remedy has. Visually, I think they have one of the better looking visual art forms in regards to, like, Quantum Break looks so unique and so different. And I think you could just, if you looked at the game, you could say, oh, that's Quantum Break. If you could see Alan Wake on a screen, you would go, oh, that's Alan Wake. It's got a visual distinction that is different than any other games on any platform. And I think the big important thing that goes with it is the types of games they make. It matches with Sony's repertoire. They make third-person action-adventure games, and that is kind of the thing that Sony does. I mean, Uncharted, Ghost of Tsushima is a third-party action-adventure game. They have so many different games that this just matches what they currently make in their first-party studios, which is not necessarily a bad thing because, again, they have that uniqueness that will make them stand out and be different than all the others in Sony's repertoire. Now, the X factor, the thing that they bring different. I think the studio is always ambitious, and I think they're not afraid to take risks. And yet when they take the risks, they're truly pretty calculated because, they most of the time it doesn't go bad. Like their reviews, they never get horrible reviews. They always get at least good reviews. So at least in like the 80s to even amazing and great reviews in the 90s. I never see them dip lower. And if it does, it's an absolute rarity. And so I think they are great about being ambitious, taking risk, but yet taking good calculated risk that would not affect their game sales and affect how the performance of the game does and overall what the game is, what they want to tell with their games. And I think, I think that's just really, really good for them because it means they're just a consistent studio that can make consistent, either good to great games for them. And that's what you're looking for when you want to acquire a studio is can they make consistent games? And I think that's something that they can offer you with that ambitious and not afraid to take that risk. Risk and reward, they're really good at it. That's why they're number 4. Now, number 3, here's where we get to we're going to get some of the really crazy different ones. They're all attainable, I promise. This one is going to be the hardest one to probably convince you, which is level 5. Now, I know what you're thinking, but just hear me out. So level 5, I think they should go after level 5. And this is why. They have amazing game series that they have worked on. They've worked on the Ni no Kuni series, which has been exclusive to PlayStation. The last 2 games they've made. Dark Cloud series, they've made that as well. They made the Yokai Watch series. I know that's on a Nintendo platform. We'll get there in a second. But I think these franchises that they make are some of the top and the best in the current RPG and JRPG genre. They make really, really good games in that genre, and I think they're always unique and they draw a different kind of audience for each kind of game. And I mean, you could just tell by Ni no Kuni, it's got the amazing visuals and amazing adventure of a children's story, yet got the adult moments in there where anyone, a kid and adult, would enjoy the tale that they're going to tell you. So I think they do an amazing job with their JRPGs and their RPGs to make them feel unique and different and appeal to a different audience than the regular JRPG audience. Now, I know they also have that great pedigree of they're known for their great pedigree of making those JRPG games. And the reason why I say this is because they bring something different and unique in regards to the type of studios that they currently have. So Sony doesn't have a Japanese I mean they have they have a Japanese studio currently, but they don't have one making JRPGs or that in that kind of genre area or an expertise in that specific area. So I think this is a perfect opportunity to add a kind of a new flavor to their library that would make it's not necessarily way off field, but it feels like it could work within the studios together, that it feels like it's a good first party studio to acquire. And the other thing that has a great advantage for them is they already have a great relationship with them, and they have a great connection to Studio Ghibli. And I think this is where they have an advantage for themselves in regards to what's going on here. I mean, they work with Studio Ghibli to make Ni no Kuni, and this could be an advantage because Sony has talked about they have a PlayStation division where they are making movies based off their games. And I think the purpose is to create movies for their games so that they have the power and the control. Wouldn't it be great if they brought in not just the Ni no Kuni franchise, but just Level 5 and their talent, their connection with Studio Ghibli, and Sony works with Studio Ghibli to make a movie based off a new property that they have or a current property that they currently have in regards to a Level 5 property. I think that's a perfect way to combine the two areas, and I think financially that is extremely smart for them. And I think that's ultimately the X factor for them. I mean, they are a giant studio and they have connections to a movie studio that can bring in extra talent. I know also that they have worked with Nintendo. They have the Yokai Watch series, which is a Nintendo platform game. I get they have another connection with another high-end game manufacturer and publisher, but this is the difference that I think that makes them different more than any other one. And I think it is that extra movie part financially is more worth throwing in the big bucks to get them to separate from Nintendo in that aspect. And could they? If they had enough money in their faces, they would separate from Nintendo. And I think the investment would be worth it because of that advantage of having a connection to a movie studio, to be able to help that division that they're working on to create movies to grow that span in Sony, and then that would possibly grow PlayStation's worth in regards to, Sony came out with its numbers recently, and they talked about how PlayStation is the most viable thing that they have going for them as Sony, the entire company of Sony. And to add Studio Ghibli to help out in regards to this aspect of making movies, this could make PlayStation boost even more, and that was worth the investment in the end. And they could work with Sony Pictures, their movie studio, and eventually Sony Pictures could take over all that divisional part. And then Sony's Pictures, I mean, it's just a great business decision beyond just the amazing games. It's also a helpful avenue in their movie sector, and I think that's just excellent. They should really go after this one if they want to do that. So that is my number 3. Now to number 2. Supermassive Games. Now, they have worked on a lot of different things, and they've had a great collaboration with Sony already currently. They have done the Little Big Planet 1 and 2 DLCs. They have worked on Killzone HD, and then they finally got to work on a big game, and they released on Sony's platform called Until Dawn, which not only did it work as a franchise for them. I mean, they had the Russian of Blood or something like that for a sequel for them, for a VR version of a shooter rail for the game, which was really fun and entertaining. But Until Dawn really has a good franchise on its feet, and I think it's a great franchise that if they chose to build on, they really could. And I think that's a great avenue for them. Now, what makes them really different than all the other studios is really the narrative. They are great at having narrative type games. And so, they used to have Quantic Dream, that was a second party that they worked with exclusively. And now it looks like that has actually went away. It looks like that Detroit Become Human really didn't sell probably the way they wanted it to. I think it's their best game they've made, but at the same time, it's not. I mean, Until Dawn is a better game overall between the two. I preferred in the end, but I think it was the better game they'd done if they just improved the story. And if I have a review for Detroit, if you want to check it out, but basically, they're no longer working together, and I think that's just because the lower success of what happened with with Detroit Become Human. And so they have lost that kind of talent, that kind of game in their library of options. And I think Until Dawn and working with Supermassive Games can bring that back into their repertoire. And I think the biggest thing for them, that the X factor that makes this say this is a better, I would have said pick them up before I would ever pick up Quantic Dream, and here's the reason why. When they came out with Until Dawn, not only did it sell really well and not only did it review really well, it kind of changed and added to the culture of gaming. It was really interesting to see, and it did way different than any of the past Quantic Dream titles. Which makes it so different is that people like YouTubers were playing this, and casual people were playing with. There was conversations constantly about people playing it with friends and talking about how they would do the decisions together to figure out what to do and how to get past this horror nightmare that they're trying to get past. And it just really captivated everyone. I mean, YouTubers were really big. When this game came out, YouTubers were all over this game. This was a great YouTuber streaming type game where I haven't really seen that very much of Detroit Become Human. And I think it's because of the type of game they were going for, the type of atmosphere, and the accessibility and the easiness of what the game was, of how the controls worked and all those aspects. And so I think it just really captivated everyone. And I think that's a type of game that Sony really doesn't have in their catalog. And I think Supermassive just did such a really good job with Until Dawn to give them more resources to say, hey, we want you to make the best narrative experience for everyone to enjoy. Go for it. I think they could do a really, really good job. I mean, they brought in great voice talent and talent to act all this stuff out. Just think of what they could do if they had some great resources from Sony. All right, now it is to my number one. This one's going to seem like off left field, but let's just give it a try. My number one studio that Sony should look into acquiring is Bungie. Yes, Bungie was the easiest pick for me to say out of all of them that they should have looked into and acquiring. Now, they have made some of the best games, the current studios that are available. They made the Halo series, and they've made Destiny 1 and 2. Now, they have some of the biggest and the most successful franchises in video games, not just in critically acclaimed, but captivated and loved by fans, and also sells really, really well. And I think what they do best is making first-person shooters. They make great first-person shooting mechanics, and Sony doesn't really have a first-person shooting studio anymore. That was Guerrilla Games, and now they're working on, and thank God they are, because the game is so good, which is Horizon Zero Dawn. I love that they're working on that franchise. They're the best ones they blew me away when they were doing that. I was like, this came from the Killzone guys. But, Bungie does first-person shooters so well that this would add another dimension, similar to like Level 5 would do with the RPGs. They just don't have a first-person shooter studio that really adds great talent to them. And I think that could really expand their base of what kind of talent what kind of people would buy their platform, especially going into the next generation. And what's really the X factor right now is that Bungie left Activision, and it seemed like they were not making enough money for Activision. Activision wasn't happy. Bungie wasn't happy the way Activision was trying to force certain practices upon them, which is understandable. Activision has been doing that for quite some time, and so I wouldn't be surprised if someone would say, no, we're not okay with this. Like, let's just walk away. And I think that's what they did, and I think it was what they did best. But I think after they left, they seemed really, really happy. But when I was looking at kind of how their conversations have happening, interviews have been happening, it seemed like when they came to do a partnership with Activision when they left Microsoft, was that yes, they wanted to make something like Destiny, but they didn't want to make Destiny was not exactly what they were envisioning of making. And I think because of the whole games with the service, I don't think they were going for that 100%. And I think because of Activision and the way they do their practices upon gamers and also upon their studios, it didn't end up the way they wanted to. But think of what they could do with the resources Sony could give them if they didn't force them to make games with a service. If they could make something that's much more evolved. Yes, they said Sony is focused more on narrative adventures, not with tons of DLC. But what if Bungie could make an adventure that continues, not necessarily under a games as service, but just continues with great narrative storytelling and great gameplay and doesn't force you to buy the season pass to keep getting that narrative content. If Sony made the investment, they could be the platform to create something incredibly unique. And if not that, just a great first-person shooter that has a great story. They could bring on some talent from the other studios that Sony owns that has great storytelling aspects that they can bring in and make a great shooter with a great story. And we all know that the shooter would be so much fun that if the story was not as amazing, it still would be a great game. And I think that's why you take a great pedigree like Bungie, you put them in there, you will be dominant in the first-person shooter market and could really compete with all the others in the first-person market. So what is your top 5 lists of studios Sony should consider acquiring to add to their studio list? Now let me know in the comments below and check out my videos and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Mitch and I'm signing off saying see you soon.